Hi, I'm Paul Cheal, and you're listening to the public relations podcast, Smoke Signal. In this episode, I speak to the go-to finance guru for creative agencies, Kathryn Williams. As a financial consultant, Kathryn works with business owners to implement more structured financial plans and drive agency growth. Anyone who's ever worked in a PR agency knows the joys of timesheets. Earlier in her career, Kathryn herself worked in Clemenger BBDO and saw firsthand the role of timesheets in driving agency profitability. But she has since seen the light. In this episode, I speak with Kathryn about an alternate way to better price our intellectual property as a profession: value-based pricing. Value-based pricing is something she's increasingly speaking with PR and comms agencies as a way to price not the things we do or the time it takes, but rather the value it delivers for the client. It is too early to call the death of the timesheets, but in Kathryn's view, value-based pricing should certainly be part of the mix for every agency. Stick around after the conversation with Kathryn. In the news this episode, I discuss the background to the public relations tech ecosystem tool that I launched earlier this month. I hope you enjoy episode 14 of Smoke Signal. Remember to rate the podcast on iTunes or subscribe via the blog. Just search Smoke Signal Podcast. So in this episode, it's great to have Kathryn Williams join us. Kathryn, thanks for joining me on Smoke Signal.
Thank you, Paul.
My interest was piqued by a blog you wrote recently on value-based pricing. As someone with a long agency background, I've been indoctrinated into the world of timesheets and tracking time as a way to measure, success and business profitability. So let's start with your definition of value-based pricing and how it differs from traditional approaches to billing in the comms sector. And perhaps in there, you can give us a bit of introduction to yourself and background on your agency and how you work with firms.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, that's right, Paul. I also worked in the industry quite a long time. I'm long in the tooth. Brought up in the Clemenger BBDO stables with timesheets. And back then, 25 years ago, I was a timesheet Nazi. I had to get all those timesheets in, and gosh, it was hard. And nothing's changed. Nobody
I feel that's my job today.
Well, the weird thing about it is you can compare our industry to others that bill by time, such as lawyers and accountants and management consultants for that matter. And they do what we do. They sell their intellectual property, and that is sold during the day, from 9 till 5 generally. And we're all paid a salary based on our hours. So we're either an FTE, full-time equivalent, or we're a pro-rata part-timer. And it's all based on us being widgets. So I guess that's where the timesheet malarkey came from. You've got to measure it. So I was brought up in the stables there and have worked only with industry, PRs, comms, digital, above the line, below the line advertising, web, events, you name it. I've worked with the agencies who are selling their intellectual property. So over the years, I've become really interested in the IP side of it. So we have skill sets that we sell, I guess, by negotiating with clients as to what the client needs for their brand to sell their commodity, whether that's products or services. And using our intellectual property, we're selling time. But it's actually far more than that. And I've become so curious with the IP side of it and the assets that we're creating for our clients. And it led me to explore further a few years back now the value-based pricing models that I've heard about and then tried to incorporate into our sector. So that's really where it all comes from. And my blog that you mentioned last month was very much focused on my own business, of the value that I deliver to clients, and also looking at others that were able to sell their results without talking about what they're going to do. So how do I improve my client's life? What is the value to my client? And if you're a PR agency or any form of agency, what are you giving your clients, not how do you do the work?
Yeah. So before we get into that value side, let's talk a little bit about timesheets. So as you mentioned, it's done by other professions, lawyers and accountants. So, why do you feel we're so wedded to them, and why do you feel they're not necessarily the right measure to use the value that we're delivering?
Yes, well, I think we're wedded to them for the reasons I mentioned before, because we are actually selling time. We're paid based on our time. But where we fall down as a sector, the Marcom sector, marketing communications, creative agencies, we're just not left brain enough to really record them and take them seriously. Yet if this is the way we sell ourselves, then it is very serious. So mostly I work with agencies that are between, say, 5 and 25 staff. And every month, those that are, say, mid-range at 10 staff, 10 to 15 staff, say, they'd be leaving between $20,000 and $50,000 on the table, just not billing, because they don't know, because they haven't done the timesheets. So if you
Yep.
don't do your timesheets, I don't know what you're doing, and I don't know whether I can bill it or not. Whereas if I was an accounting firm, they bill in 6-minute increments. If I was a legal firm, they're probably the same. They're billing in 5-minute increments. And they record everything from the minute you pick up the phone and talk to them. They're recording. And this is why, generally speaking, they're much, much more profitable than our sector. Management accountants, very much the same, but they also would implement a value-based pricing model. It is quite separate to timesheet pricing, but they can be run together. There's at least 12 modes of different pricing, and time is one, and commission would be another, markup would be another, payment by results or value-based pricing would be another.
I imagine it's not just not filling in the timesheets correctly, it's also the fact that often we're on retainer basis, right? So even if you do fill in the timesheets correctly, if you're over servicing, then you're not billing billing that time effectively anyway.
Yes, that's right. So again, I guess this comes down to how a firm manages its most important assets or its resourcing, which is our people. So if there's a culture internally for allowing over-servicing, then that will just continue. There's not every job will be run perfectly to time. I've never seen that ever. But sometimes you'll find jobs can be completed in less than the budgeted amount of time. So that I see quite often, and it kind of goes unsung, but it should be celebrated because we've been able to achieve the results within a lesser amount of time, and thus charging the clients potentially more, but because we've been clever, we've been able to deliver it quicker. Well, the overruns are generally a result of two common reasons. One would be it's an external factor that has caused us to run over, often beyond our control. And in PRs and comms, it will be because the clients have changed what they require or we've struck some difficulty with the media. The alternative would be it would be something internally that we've been unable to control, and that usually would be our staff are not skilled enough, or we've had too many people working on the job that were not budgeted for in the first place. So it appears that we've overrun. And that would generally happen again because we've got seniors checking on junior staff.
Yep.
So they're kind of the overruns. And I would say that it's poor management that every job overruns. We must be pricing incorrectly, or we're giving more away and not valuing ourselves. And this is before we even get to value-based pricing.
Yeah.
Part of it, though, I think you're probably going to press me on is the value to the client. They won't pay more for a media release, or they won't pay more than a certain figure, which we would know as business owners. So there's a tolerance from the client's perspective, and then after that, they just won't pay anymore. So we then have to question ourselves whether we're making profit on it or not. Should we be outsourcing that particular work, or do we need to train and put better processes in place for cheaper resources to work on that particular type of work?
So how does value-based pricing work? So how do you determine the costs or I guess the value for a specific project? And I guess in your experience, what are some of those success metrics look like? I think everyone listening would say there's a lot of different things we do day in, day out. So how do you assign value to each of those?
Yeah, look, this is a new space. Well, it's not new because it's been talked about for years, but it's new for many agencies, and those listening to this podcast have probably got some inkling or idea that they'd like to put a value-based pricing or BBP pricing policy on internally, but don't really know where to start. So I guess I'd like to start by indicating that you're not going to throw away time billing. It's something to add to. And in some cases, some clients will prefer the value-based pricing model to the old retainer or project-based costings on time. So you pick your clients carefully to put a toe in the water and try it first. And I would say probably be looking at a client that you can trial this with that has some certainty around the metrics they're looking for. So they'll be looking for qualitative and quantitative results that you can measure your success on. You should be able to do this at the beginning so that you could even approach them with a VBP model. An example would be coverage, value of sales, potentially on units, not dollars. Qualitative could be something maybe the owners of your client's business or the seniors would like to attend certain events. Did you get them to those events? Did they get to meet the people they wanted to meet? Did it make it easier internally for them? Is there a process that's made them more efficient that we've helped with? Those things, eventually all roads lead to money, but these are things that are more qualitative than quantitative. So getting into their world, what's it worth to them? And only they will know, or if we know their sector quite well, we will also have a pretty good clue as to what is important to them. So in my world, one of the things I do is work very much with my agencies on their annual budget, and then we review that monthly or quarterly, depending on the agency size. That's hugely valuable to a business owner who's never had a budget before, and there are a few around, or who slacks off or things through fall the cracks and they just lose track of it. It's very valuable to have that provided to them, backed then with monthly meetings and team KPIs. So these are the results of the work I do. So I don't talk about how long it takes. I don't talk about what I do to get that process. It's just this is the end result. What is the value to the client? And the results to them in my world would probably be more around the frequency of the reporting, the accuracy of the reporting, who's involved in the reporting, putting the responsibility on the second tier and taking it off the back of the business owners. So in the PR and comms world, you'll be thinking about the client, whether that be the marketing director or the whole business itself and the CEO. What are the important things for those people and their business? So ideally,
which is ultimately what we should be trying to do anyway, as for any kind of piece of work, right? Is to try and create a business outcome.
Completely.
For our clients.
I've worked with some amazing comms agencies last year in 2018, and I was pleasantly surprised to see there's about 6 of them that are actually now presenting their proposal documents about the ROI. It's actually not about what they do. That'd be a small piece somewhere at the back. But of course, we're coming to the client with a solution and we're talking only about the results we deliver. And that's based on experience we've had with other like brands and experience and confidence that we know what we're doing.
And in the blog, you mentioned it's quite good if you can present these graphically, that kind of value.
Definitely. I mean, a picture tells 1,000 words, and these donut graphs and grids and bar charts, they look great. They can be as colourful as you like, and they can be on any topic. So whether it's number of meetings or number of clicks through the door or number of units sold, they visually represent a static position and an increased ideal position. So you could pick today's results, what is it today, and then you'll predict what would you like it to be in 6 months' time or 12 months' time. And based on history or historic details, we can get you there in X amount of time, months. So it does look good, and it allows you to talk to them rather than read through dot points on a proposal document.
Yeah. And so is this different to outcomes pricing? I mean, I guess when I hear this, it's, if you talk about, say, media coverage, for example, I mean, how do you place value on a piece in, the Australian or the Sydney Morning Herald or whatever it may be? And then doesn't this just lead to a bit of a paid for placement kind of model, which seems a bit of a grey area to be going into?
Yeah, look, I think it's similar in as much that you're aiming for such coverage at that level on the broadsheets, sure. But if that's a normal result for your agency, then it's not really special, but for the client, it might be. So for the client, they've probably never received any of that level of coverage before, potentially, in which case it would be hugely valuable to them. Whereas if the client is used to being on those pages or getting that level of coverage and volume, then it's just normal position for them. It's not exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking more about the client and what's normal for them or what would be exceptional for them. So you would have had to have done your research to know the answers to this. And that's all the questions that you ask them in your first meetings. You get as much out of them as possible to understand how valuable is it going to be.
And how high level do you go? Do you talk about impact on sales, or it could even be, I don't know, we get us to an IPO through your support, but I guess how do you assign the value you're delivering or PR is delivering versus other elements of the mix that may be helping to deliver that sales increase or that high level business goal?
Yeah, so if it was an easy answer, I think everybody would be doing it. So,
Yep.
once you've decided that you're actually going to give this a whirl, putting in those metrics or those targets is your next hardest thing. And then assigning a value, a price to it, is probably the third and most difficult step. Because this comes down to two things. Firstly, what will the market bear? And secondly, your confidence. So, as a business owner, if you're not a pricing expert, it's not something you probably do every week or every month. And I guess my role here is working with the industry across Australia, multi agencies, is seeing what other agencies have done and what's successful in the eyes of the client, and I guess bringing that knowledge as to what would be an acceptable range. And I'd always be providing a range from, say, this price to a client, so they've got an indication of what it might cost them if we deliver option A, B, or C, and C being kind of the lower level and A being the ultimate kind of top tier. The other thing that comes into play about pricing is how long is the benefit to be seen by the client? So if it's something that's going to last for multiple years, if it's something that's going over multiple territories, um, and it's of huge value to them, it would probably be a higher price guide than something that's just going to be relevant for the next week, not going to live much longer than that. And you can certainly get to dollar figures regarding sales if you have access to that data. And sometimes the clients don't actually have access to that, so it's a bit tricky.
Yeah. I might put you on the spot here. I don't know if you can answer this, but can you talk to an example without naming names or anything like that, but of a kind of example of this is what the client was trying to do and this is how it was packaged up and
Yes,
priced?
definitely. So I don't need to use names; it's fine. So in the communication sector, I'll just pick a territory that they're kind of working in this space quite a lot these days, which is the influencers. We previously might have called them brand ambassadors, endorsing product or services. So for that, we've been looking to have a particular person or profile on board using the product, talking about the product. We'd also be looking to promote that through our social platforms, mostly through Twitter and Facebook, etc. So all of these components take one of our staff members to come up with a strategic approach, put a document together, present that to the client, get the sign off. We've probably already spoken to the influencer to see if they'd be interested. We know what the costs are for our Facebook, our MailChimp, our Twitter, etc. To buy clips if we're using Campaign Monitor. We've got all our cost base already organised. We know what our staff cost us. So we've got something that we have presented to the client. They said, yes, we know our cost base, and now we're going to actually execute the work, do the work, and at the end of that, we'll collate the results and present it back to the client. So nothing's different here. It's what we always do, and we're going to probably use time as a bit of a cost for our people and hard costs plus some markup for our risk, our profit, and I guess our ability to call the right people at the right time and get response. So once we've added all of this together, it'll be a starting price. But the value-based pricing comes in based on how much you can bundle it for and potentially frequency that you might be rolling it. So if it's monthly or quarterly or daily, and then offering it to the client as a fixed price rather than the scope creep that might come at extras, once they go over their budget. And I guess
Yeah.
that's the difference. It could be known as fixed pricing, which we kind of do with retainers. But then in a retainer, if you outdo that price or go over that, you'll seek to recover that from a client, and that's the nasty surprise. Or
Yeah.
you don't because you overrun and you have to suck it up. But the value-based pricing, it's supposed to be more than enough to cover all your costs and recognise the value you're providing to your client. If you don't know what the value is to the client, it's hard to price. And again, it's a little bit elusive. So I would say you might be looking at a range of prices and that tiered pricing, A, B, and C.
Yeah. And do you find that agencies still, to come to that pricing, they still estimate hours as a kind of starting point, and then do they track hours during that process to guess see how it would have compared versus an hour timesheet
Yeah.
system?
There's two ways. So some agencies tend to naturally default to that, and I will encourage that because it gets you to see the baseline, and we still would record timesheets to see if we're falling within the value-based price. So let's say we've costed something up that's $5,000. As we're going through the month to deliver that $5,000, we still want to know what our costs are. We don't want to see any of that blowout. So we can cost it up as we traditionally would with the hour model and externals. Alternatively, I've worked with some agencies who just say, okay, my revenue or gross profit for the month, the target is 100,000 and I've got 4 clients and I need to bill them 25K each. So that's how they price it. So they
Yep.
don't actually care what the time is at this point. As long as I hit my GP target, that's how I'm going to price it. And if you've got 20 clients, you just simply divide it by 20 if it was all equal. But they'll really just try and look to generate that GP, that revenue from the client base they've got, and just make it like little blocks to add up to that total.
But then if I'm an agency, say 10 people, as you mentioned earlier, how do I then resource that? And how do I know 10 people is enough to meet my revenue targets and support all the work, all the project work that we're estimating?
Yeah, so I'm seeing a change over the years as to how people resource. And the more aggressive agencies will resource from the top down. If I don't have the income, I won't have the people. The old model, which I've been brought up with and I'm used to seeing in most 90% of the agencies I work with, is from the bottom up. I've got this staff base and I've always got a gap as to what I need to cover their costs and hit that revenue target. So it's harder because you've got that fixed staff cost. Whereas I guess the more modern or the flexible agencies are resourcing the other way based on what they need, which matches the trend that we're seeing in staffing, where the loyalty has all but gone. The likelihood that staff will stay longer than 2 years is less and less, and so freelancers are more available. And yes, you might appear to pay more for them, but that's because you're not giving them paid annual leave and sick leave and long service leave, etc. But it is a more efficient way to staff up if you have a good resourcing pool. And there's some great hubs around now that provide those resources. And in the comms sector, particularly with writers and designers, there are global pools where you can get best practice from outside of Australian shores. Because we're always saying there's a scarcity of talent here.
Yeah.
So it does make it easier to resource. It still comes at an hourly cost, right? So whenever you're hiring people, you're still forced to consider the hourly rate for a freelancer or your own staff. But you want to be looking way beyond that when you're pricing using the VBP model.
So once you start getting into this, it changes the fundamental ways that you run agencies.
Yes, you do need to be a little bit more aggressive on it and be very confident on how you implement that value-based pricing. A lot of business owners that have been in the game for a while are more confident. So they know for me to deliver this particular service, it will cost me, let's say it's $1,500 and I'm selling it for $3,000. And they know that. The problem is that the staff that they have don't necessarily know that because it's not clear, and they might budget for it in capacity plans. They might have costed that way when they present it to client, but when they're actually doing the work, they take longer. And there's no consequence. So it's a challenge. So at the end of the month when they're reporting all their over-servicing, there's a very loose process to how to drill down into where the problems are, train and re-educate the team and what to do. Now, if we were lawyers or accountants or management consultants, we would be managing that scope very carefully. The management consultant sector, though, are way ahead of us in that they don't necessarily price based on the hours. They are value-based pricing and more inclined to charge a much higher price because all of this underlying work is just standard for them.
Yeah. So it almost feels like, I mean, the one that comes to mind for me is media training. It's a package. It's something, this is what we're going to deliver. It's going to be a half day. We'll train your spokespeople. This will be the outcome. This is what they'll get from that. And it's a half day and it's done and it's a fixed price. It feels like that kind of
it's a nice example.
Yeah.
And if you look outside of our sector and look at other bundled items or valued items, another great example to kind of steal from or learn from would be the automotive industry. I'm going to buy a car. It's got 4 wheels. It's got a front windscreen, a back windscreen. It's got little tickers that go tick, tick, tick. I'm turning left and right. But one's got a Lamborghini badge on it and the other doesn't. So you would think you're buying something that does the same, gets you from A to B, but you're actually buying quality, brand reputation, absolute surety that this Lamborghini is going to also make you look good. So these are the kind of thinking that one would price a client, because a certain client is going to want that Lamborghini, whereas the others don't see the value in that. They just want a car that's going to get them from A to B. They're going to get a product or a service delivery that just does the job. So it's actually not for everything you do, which is why I suggested you pick a client where you think this could really work, because not every client can see the value of paying more for, say, the Lamborghini service.
And that was a question I was going to ask. So how does that conversation with the client, what does that look like? And are clients often open to this, or are they confused because this is different? This is not the way I've ever done it in the past. How does that kind of conversation go?
Yeah, so again, client by client, and before you would even approach a client, we would have rehearsed internally. So we'd be absolutely confident that this would be the ultimate solution for this client, and it's the best way for them to go. We quite often wouldn't even offer them anything else. So it's probably right for a new client that hasn't worked with you before, that might be interested in working on this sort of model, not reverting to the industry traditional model. So again, they don't know how you work. They weren't with you yesterday. They don't know what your pricing structure is until you present it to them, and you're presenting it to them as a solution to the problems that you've either identified through conversation with them, or you've done your own research and you know what needs to happen for them to be better than their competitors. So what you present is so compelling to them, they're actually not thinking about widgets anymore and timesheets and those types of costs. They're just looking at the solutions that you deliver, and then perhaps out of the choice of 3 options you give them, they pick one.
Yeah. And I imagine I guess one of the biggest challenges for you is that, and you've spoken a little bit about that, the owners of or the founders of the agency, shifting their mindset. But what happens when you speak to people within agencies? And I'm thinking, especially professionals starting out or kind of mid-career, what's their view on the whole timesheet system and how it's working?
The staff or the business owners?
Yeah, the staff.
The
So I
staff.
imagine the business owner's mindset is something you need to change. But what do the staff think? Do they see the value in them, or they see the kind of negative
Some
aspects of
do.
them?
Yeah, some agencies I work with are quite transparent with the timesheets, in as much that it's such a big deal that the only way to get people, whether it's timesheets or anything else, to be involved is if they can see a reason and they can see that there's a benefit. So the way I like to implement it is through the KPI program, where we've got 40 hours a week. It's about 160 hours a month. So I'd like to see how you've accounted for your time for the month. And if, let's say, a normal month would be that you're short 60 hours, then I'd like to see it improve. I'd like to see you putting 160 hours into your timesheets. And I actually don't mind at this point what you're doing. Just want to see that the time is in. So
Yeah,
then when we're reporting this on a monthly basis with the team, look, it sounds a little bit naff to say it's a challenge or it's a game, but you do kind of need to gamify it. And I also add it into dollar figures, because when we see that you've missed 60 hours at $200 an hour, it starts to add up pretty quickly if you've got 10 people on the team. And it will get to $20,000 or $50,000. And there's nothing better than looking at the team's faces and saying, that's like 20 grand we just threw off the table. We just lost 50 fell on the floor. That's not how we run a business when we're selling our precious time. Whereas the agencies down the street are recording it properly, and I'm talking about the lawyers and management accountants, and they're driving Lamborghinis. It is something that's really important to us, and we want to see, because if you're spending too much time on admin, that's an advantage too, because I want to give you some more support systems. And if our senior resources are doing too many manual things, I would like to see that too, because I'd rather them be focused on training my team or getting on new business or attending industry events, rather than doing admin work that we get somebody offshore to do potentially, or we could implement this system that automates it. So it's just as important to see that sort of work and where we're spending our time. And also clients that are particularly draining or want more of a particular thing so that we can resource up accordingly and respond.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read Neil Beckwith's book, The Managing Professional Communication Agencies.
No, not yet, but I think I'll have to write
Okay,
it
but
down now.
he talks about the challenge with timesheets, right? Is because anyone can make timesheets read the way that you want them to, so we can make it add up to the numbers that, say, an agency owner may want to see. But the challenge really isn't about the billable time that you've put in. It's really about the build time. It's about how much of that have actually billed to clients rather than just being written off or over service or investment time or whatever other kind of phrase that you put into those times. You also, it doesn't matter if you put that time in if you're not able to bill the clients for it.
Yes, absolutely. So this comes back to something we touched on a little bit earlier about internal, external forces as to why we may not have billed all that time, even though it was allocated to this particular job and this particular client. So the most common reasons are internal. We're just taking too long to do the job, which might mean we're quoting incorrectly. So that would be one I feel like I'm talking more about timesheets here than value-based pricing. But to answer the question, if we are recording time and it is taking us that time genuinely, there's been some great examples I've had in my history where I've seen a particular job 3 months, and we can see every month how long this job takes. And it genuinely does take 12 hours, but perhaps our costing was based on it taking 8 hours. But it consistently takes longer, so our costing was all wrong. In other cases, it should only take us $1,000 worth of time, but invariably, if we give it to this staff member, it'll take $2,000 worth of time. So there's some training required there. So it really is looking and delving as to, well, why is it taking us longer? Why can't we bill that extra? Are we just underpricing, undervaluing ourselves? Or is that service not really valued by clients so we can't charge them anymore? Or are we just rubbish at doing it? We need to train our people. So there's a reason, and I think it's important that we look at it so that we can improve internally.
Yeah. That's probably my fault around talking about timesheets too much. I'm quite interested in this aspect of agency profitability, and so and timesheets has kind of been the traditional
Paul,
way to
I don't
do
think
that.
it's broken. I think it just needs to be managed with respect. And looking at some of the counter industries that are doing the same thing, they do it so well. One might say they're boring industries, but they actually make a lot of money by just billing the time. And I would say, as I've said a couple of times in our chat now, there could be $20,000 or $50,000 a month just being pushed on the floor. Now that's my game. That's what I'm playing for. And most of the agencies I work with, we look to close that gap. And let's just say we don't push 20 grand off onto the floor, that we actually looked at ways to bill that properly or not spend so long on the job. If we've delivered what was promised to the client, and there's a tolerance here, we might surprise and delight them as well, then stop. Spend some time on something else. That's either growing the account, so it's recorded as BD now, or it's on BD generally for the business or professional development, but don't keep over-servicing the client because you're setting yourself up for a fail, as in over-servicing. We can't bill a client that expects this level of hours and service for a really minuscule price. So this is not the way we run a business, and I think every member of staff should understand that. Otherwise, we could probably put the same policy on their pay and see how we go.
So how can an agency start, I guess, take steps to introduce value-based pricing? What would be your top tips, I guess, to get this moving forward for an agency?
Yeah, so it is a pricing policy. At the end of the day, a policy is something that is documented, and that's the process we follow internally. So I would pick something quite simple, which could be a press release, or it could be media training would be an example. It could be campaign document, putting something together as in a strategic document, and start to look at the widgets that come into this particular service. How long does it take? What other contribution into this particular task, so external costs plus the markups, and get yourself a base price. Double check it against what's actually happening to see if it is realistic. Now I'd look at how am I going to sell that to which client. So look at a client you have and say, now what's the true value to them? So you need to know what they're looking at and tracking at for that value-based price to differentiate between what you've just costed up as the traditional model. So it might be another $15,000 on top of your traditional model pricing, just as a random guess, because you've been able to justify what will happen at the client's end with their sales, with their people, with their efficiencies, and the autonomy for them to be able to turnkey this internally. So just it's a random couple of things there about qualitative, quantitative. And if it improves their position, how do you quantify that? And then what price would you put on it? If you can document it and present it to a client, then nothing needs to terms and conditions change. None of that needs to change. Your payment terms don't really need to change. They can still be on retainer or base. It's just how you sell that ultimate price into the client. And then instead of tracking hours of widgets for the client, you'll actually track the deliverables.
And where would you say PR is on the I guess on a scale of 1 to 10 on the journey to value-based pricing across the industries that you kind of cover? Where would you say PR is sitting? Are we kind of at the 1 just starting out, or are you seeing it become more and more common?
That's a good question. So the PRs that are, I guess, playing in the space of strategic, creative thinking at the beginning of their campaigns, they would probably be sitting at a 5. Those that are not, that are providing that almost as a free service, are missing a trick. The agencies that are creating brand names, and certainly design agencies that are designing devices or images, logos, etc., they're well ahead because they're actually pricing that product that's delivered for a longer term use. So that not just what it costs to deliver it today, but how long is the client going to use it and where are they going to use it. So they're probably sitting at a 7 or 8. Whether they implement it every single time is still why I'm not giving them a 10. So yeah, I think PRs probably, my experience is they undervalue their strategic and creative thinking, and they probably miss completely the fact that they should be using trademarks and registered copyright signs all over their work, because this is the intellectual property that right at the beginning they create for their clients, and the clients at that point could walk away with that document and those ideas and run it themselves somewhere else. That is probably the most valuable piece, and it's at this point that the value-based pricing model should be ignited, and then as you go through the program, it's probably bundle prices and deliverables that you'll be clocking instead. So they could get there. They could get from a 2, 3 to something closer to a 7, 8. But then again, it's not every single client you can work this on.
Well, thank you, Kathryn. That's been really interesting, and I'll include a link on to your blog, which I found a really good read, and it's been a great discussion to kind of dive into value-based pricing a bit more.
Thank you.
Before I let you go, every episode I do a bit of rapid-fire Q&A, so just some quick question and answers. So if you weren't doing what you're doing now, what would you be doing?
As in right now, this moment?
No, if you weren't running your own agency. Sure.
Oh, I think I'd be an artist. Yeah, I love painting, particularly watercolors.
Fantastic. Do you do that on the side or no time?
I do with my son. Okay. He's doing the class, but I want to go on the junket to Vienna and St. Petersburg later this year.
Fair enough. What do you like most about your role?
I think I like most working with business owners and their senior teams because they have a business, it's successful, and they're doing it really well. They just need a little bit of help on that financial side, which for me comes quite easily. And I, working with them, can see them jump ahead leaps and bounds, and it's hugely satisfying as I get to learn how they do their craft a little bit better too. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's often not their core skill, right? Running the business. Yeah. It's about doing the job.
Yeah, and just bringing confidence to them because they actually do know. They're probably selling themselves short a little because they've got to where they are. But it's this confidence building, and trademark myself the financial soulmate because I understand the pain points they've been through, and to bring them the confidence and clarity around their figures, it will just help them for the long term.
Is there a book or a blog that you would recommend PR practitioners need to read or follow?
Oh, there's a great book that I read a little while ago now called Pricing with Confidence. And it was quite an easy read. It had 10 steps to stop leaving money on the table. And I got a lot of my terminology from reading Pricing with Confidence. It's by two guys, Holden and Burton. And it just, as I said, it's an easy read, but it was just the language was really great to get out of that book. I thought the contribution to my own knowledge in the space was great. Just stop leaving money on the table.
Yeah, I'm adding that to my list now.
Great.
What's one piece of advice you'd give someone starting out in their PR career?
Ask lots of questions. And the biggest piece of advice I got was actually from, a long time ago now, but it was, if you don't ask, you won't get. And if you do ask, there's a 50-50 chance that the person will say yes or no. Just go and ask. Ask all the questions. Ask mentors. Ask people that have done it before you. And there's a 50-50 chance that they'll say, yes, I'll help you, or yes, this is the answer. It's just ask.
And if I should interview one other person for this podcast, who would you recommend?
Well, given this is about value and pricing and intellectual property a little bit, I think I'd probably recommend my colleague Justin Denishwal. Now, Justin is an IP lawyer and he runs his own legal practice, Centreworth Legal Partners. I think he'd be great. He only works in the creative space, and he could really extend on from what I'm saying.
Okay, great. That's a good tip. All right, Kathryn, thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed that and appreciate you sharing your wisdom.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Paul. It's been good chatting about it, and anytime my phone lines are open, ready for a call.
In the news this episode, I wanted to have a brief discussion on the PR technology ecosystem that I released earlier this month. I recently did extensive research for my agency on different tools for media monitoring, distribution, and analytical tools on the market, and it got me thinking about the ever-increasing role of technology is playing in the practice of PR, and the variety of technology tools that we are using now as a profession. I mapped the technology ecosystem across 8 different areas of PR practice. The likes of Meltwater, Factiva, or Isentia in media monitoring segment are likely quite well known. But there's also a growing array of social media management and analytics tools that are increasingly helping with community management and measurement of social impact. Many of the tools in the podcast section are ones that I've become familiar with over the past year in recording this podcast. Surprisingly, the cost of many of these are very low. And of course, there's numerous tools for media engagement. Here, Public Address, which I interviewed founder Shane Allison last episode, sits alongside the likes of Tellem, SourceBottle, and MediaNet. I hope the tool gives practitioners a starting point for what technology tools are out there, and I hope it can be shared and added to, as this is an area that will continue to evolve and change in coming years. It's also an increasingly important area for PR practice, and technology is certainly an area that I want to focus on in future episodes of Smoke Signal. And of course, I welcome your feedback. You've been listening to Paul Cheal on episode 14 of Smoke Signal. As always, remember to rate the podcast on iTunes or subscribe via the blog. Just search Smoke Signal Podcast.